The way we treat animals speaks volumes about our humanity. Jane Goodall. Have you ever looked into the eyes of a stray dog and wondered what stories they carry? How many cold nights they've endured? How many times they've been chased away, longing for just one act of kindness? This is the story of Titan, a pit bull who had nothing, no home, no family, and no reason to believe in humans anymore. But what if one small act of compassion could change everything? What if, in saving an abandoned dog, a family found a guardian, a protector, and an unbreakable bond? Stay with me until the very end, because this isn't just a story. It's a powerful reminder of loyalty, second chances, and how love can heal even the deepest wounds. Subscribe to Veilmarks today and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support is what keeps these meaningful stories alive. Let's spread compassion, one story at a time. The wind howled through the abandoned docks, whistling between rusted shipping containers and rattling loose metal sheets that clung desperately to the skeletal remains of old warehouses. The scent of salt and decay hung thick in the air, a mixture of ocean spray and the lingering staleness of a place long forgotten. A lone street lamp flickered, its dim glow reflecting off the inky black water lapping against the wooden piers, barely illuminating the desolate stretch of concrete where the only sign of life lay curled into a motionless heap. Titan, once a powerful and proud pit bull, now resembled nothing more than a ghost of his former self. His brindle coat, once sleek and gleaming under the sun, was now matted with dirt and grime. His ribs pressed against his thin skin, each breath a slow, labored rise and fall. He lay on the cold pavement, tucked into the shadows where he could go unseen, forgotten, just as the world had long since abandoned him. His eyes, once sharp and alert, had dulled over time, clouded not by age, but by a slow erosion of hope. They were not the eyes of a fighter anymore, nor the eyes of a predator. They were the eyes of a soul resigned to a fate he no longer had the strength to fight against. His body had once been a weapon, a force of protection and strength, trained to guard, to intimidate. Now, that same body betrayed him with hunger, fatigue, and wounds that never quite healed. Titan had not always been alone. There was a time not long ago when his days were filled with purpose. He had belonged to a man, a gruff, heavy-set dock worker named Victor, who ran an import business along the waterfront. Titan had been raised in the warehouse, his paws accustomed to the feel of concrete floors beneath him, his ears trained to pick up even the faintest sound of movement in the dead of night. He had been loyal, steadfast, the kind of dog who never needed a leash because he knew his place was at his master's side, but loyalty meant nothing in a world that changed without warning. One night, flashing red and blue lights bathed the warehouse walls. Men in dark uniforms stormed through the storage facility, shouting commands, shoving Victor to the ground as they confiscated crates and seized paperwork. Titan had barked, growled, prepared to defend the only family he had ever known, but a sharp command from Victor had made him freeze in place. The door slammed shut behind them, and just like that, his world crumbled. The men who came after weren't like Victor. They didn't feed him. They didn't speak to him. They only saw a problem, a liability. At first, Titan had waited, certain his master would return. He had sat by the rusted door of the warehouse for hours, then days, ignoring the gnawing hunger twisting in his gut. The warehouse workers, who once passed him with nods of respect, now avoided him altogether. Some whispered, others cast wary glances, and then, one by one, they were gone too. The warehouse doors were locked, the trucks stopped coming. Titan had never known what it meant to be truly alone until that moment. The first few nights were the worst. Hunger clawed at his insides like a living thing, relentless and unforgiving. He wandered the empty streets of the dockyards, scavenging where he could, drinking from dirty puddles. The few people he encountered recoiled at the sight of him. Some threw rocks, others shouted. The ones who feared him the most were the cruelest. Once, he had approached a man outside a seafood shop, drawn by the scent of fish tossed carelessly into a dumpster. Titan had crept forward, his tail low, his ears pinned back, not in aggression but in silent pleading. The man's response had been swift and brutal. A sharp kick to the ribs sent Titan stumbling back, yelping as he collapsed against the pavement. The man had muttered something under his breath, something about Pitbulls, about how they were nothing but trouble. Titan hadn't tried again after that. He learned which alleys offered the most shelter from the wind, which streets to avoid when the night shift ended and the drunks staggered home. He avoided eye contact, kept his head low. The Titan who once stood tall beside Victor was gone. In his place was a creature that flinched at sudden movements, that limped through the back streets of a city that had no place for him. Now, as he lay curled against the cold pavement of the docks, the hunger had faded into something quieter, something deeper. The nights were no longer restless. He had given up searching. He no longer looked toward the streets for a familiar face. He no longer pricked his ears at the sound of passing footsteps. No one was coming for him. The wind howled through the empty docks again, sending a shiver down his spine. His paws twitched in his sleep, a subconscious memory of a time when he used to chase after thrown tennis balls, when his legs carried him with boundless energy instead of weary exhaustion. But when he opened his eyes again, he was still here, still alone. A distant sound broke the monotony of the wind, the soft, rhythmic tapping of footsteps against concrete. They were light, hesitant, not the heavy boots of dock workers or the hurried strides of those who ignored him. Titan barely flicked an ear, too tired to care. But then, a voice. Small, curious. "Are you cold?" Titan's muscles tensed. The voice was unlike any he had heard in a long time. Gentle, unafraid. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. A child stood a few feet away, bundled in a thick coat, golden hair peeking from beneath a woolen hat. A child. Titan had seen many things in his time at the docks: workers, police, stray cats slinking between crates, but never a child. They didn't belong here, in this forgotten place. The little girl didn't step forward, didn't reach out. She simply stood there, watching him, eyes full of something Titan didn't recognize. Not fear, not disgust, something else entirely. For the first time in months, Titan felt something stir in his chest. A flicker, barely there, but real. Hope. He didn't move, didn't dare. He only stared back as if afraid that if he so much as blinked, the child would disappear. And maybe, just maybe, this time he wouldn't be left behind. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the small seaside town, but the wind carried a sharp bite that hinted at the approaching winter. The ocean waves crashed rhythmically against the weathered wooden piers, their endless motion a soothing contrast to the stillness of the nearly abandoned docks. Madison pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she walked beside her daughter, watching as Ella skipped a few steps ahead, her tiny boots clicking against the uneven pavement. Madison had never been particularly fond of the docks, but it had become a quiet retreat after long shifts at the diner where she worked. The salty air was crisp, the sound of the waves calming, and for a little while it gave her and Ella a moment to just breathe. Life as a single mother was demanding, and though she carried her burdens well, there were days when the exhaustion pressed down heavier than others. Today was one of those days. Ella, however, was untouched by her mother's weariness. At 4 years old, her world was still full of wonder. She had an endless supply of energy and an unshakable love for all creatures, big and small. A stray cat, a lost bird, even the spiders that wove their delicate webs in the corners of their tiny apartment. Ella cared for them all. She was the kind of child who would stop in the middle of the sidewalk just to rescue an earthworm stranded after the rain. But she had never met a dog like Titan before. They had been walking along the edge of the pier when Ella suddenly stopped, her head tilting slightly as if she had heard something Madison hadn't. Without a word, the little girl turned and took a step toward an old, rusted warehouse. Madison followed her gaze and frowned. There, beneath the crumbling overhang of the building, lay a dog. At first, Madison wasn't even sure it was alive. The animal's body was curled in on itself, pressed against the cold pavement, as though trying to disappear into the shadows. Its fur, once a rich brindle, she guessed, was dull and dirty, its frame worryingly thin. It didn't lift its head, didn't move at all, except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of its chest. A stray, and a big one at that. Madison instinctively reached for Ella's hand, but the little girl had already taken a step forward. "Ella," Madison warned softly, but her daughter ignored her. The little girl approached slowly, each step careful and deliberate. There was no hesitation in her movement, no fear in her wide, curious eyes. She was close enough now that Madison could see the dog's eyes, dark, hollow, distant. Yet something in the way he looked at Ella made Madison pause. Titan had spent months watching the world from the edges, an invisible creature that no one wanted to see. Every human he had encountered in those months had been either indifferent or cruel. Hands had struck him, voices had shouted at him, feet had kicked him aside. He had learned over time that people were best avoided. But this child... She was different. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She didn't throw anything at him or scream for her mother to pull her away. Instead, she simply sat down. Madison's breath caught in her throat as she watched her daughter lower herself onto the cold pavement, her little legs crossing neatly in front of her as if she were about to start story time at preschool. She wasn't close enough to touch the dog, but she was near enough that if he wanted to, he could reach her in a single motion. "Ella," Madison tried again, stepping forward. Still, the little girl didn't look away. She just sat there, hands resting in her lap, watching the dog as if he were the most interesting thing in the world. For the first time in months, Titan didn't move away. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth, didn't flinch at the sound of approaching footsteps. He simply stared back at her, his dark eyes unreadable, as though trying to make sense of this tiny, fearless human in front of him. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, in the softest voice, Ella spoke. "Are you cold?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the wind. "I don't like the wind when it's this strong either." Titan's ears twitched. It was such a small thing, such an insignificant motion. But to Madison, it felt monumental. Ella shifted slightly, tucking her hands into the sleeves of her coat. "You look sad," she observed. "Are you all alone?" Titan blinked. And then, so subtly that if Madison had not been watching, she might have missed it, his tail moved. Just once, a slow, hesitant wag barely disturbing the air. But it was there. Madison exhaled, her heart pounding. She had seen many stray dogs before, had passed them on the streets, had watched them skitter away at the first sign of human presence. But she had never seen one react like this. Ella, oblivious to the significance of the moment, simply smiled. "I think you need a friend," she told the dog. Titan didn't move closer, but he didn't look away either, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself believe, just for a fleeting second, that maybe, just maybe, this small human wasn't like the others. Madison didn't know what to do. She wasn't an impulsive person, not when it came to decisions like this. She was practical, careful. She had spent years making safe choices, ensuring that Ella had stability, that they had enough to get by. And yet, as she looked at the way her daughter and this broken creature simply existed in the same space, as if they had been waiting for each other all along, she felt something shift inside her. This was a mistake. It had to be. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew she wasn't going to walk away. Ella turned back to her, eyes bright with something Madison hadn't seen in a long time. "Mommy," she said simply, "can we help him?" Madison didn't answer right away. She glanced back at the dog, at the way he was watching Ella, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something that looked almost like recognition. As if maybe he had been waiting for her too. And against all logic, against all hesitation, Madison found herself nodding. "We'll see," she murmured. Ella Sanrio. Titan exhaled softly, and in that moment, for the first time since he had been left behind, the world felt just a little less cold. Madison stood frozen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as she watched Ella sitting in front of the battered, broken dog. The wind picked up, pushing loose strands of Madison's dark hair across her face, but she barely noticed. Her gaze was locked on the unlikely pair, her daughter, small and fearless, and the Pitbull, massive yet unmoving, watching the little girl with an expression she couldn't quite define. Madison's instincts screamed at her to pull Ella away. It wasn't just the size of the dog. It wasn't just the fact that his breed carried a reputation that made people cross the street when they saw one on a leash. It was everything. The thinness of his body, the dullness in his eyes, the way his ribs pushed against his matted coat. He looked like a dog that had given up, a dog that had lived through things no creature should have to endure. And yet, he hadn't reacted the way she expected. No growling, no baring of teeth, no tense stance of warning. He simply lay there, his dark eyes watching Ella as if trying to understand her. Madison's heart pounded. She wasn't a reckless person. She had spent the last 4 years making cautious choices, careful decisions, doing everything in her power to keep Ella safe and their little world stable. A child and a struggling single mother, they weren't exactly in a position to take in a half-starved, possibly aggressive pit bull. "Mommy?" Ella's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned her head slightly, meeting her daughter's hopeful gaze. "Can we take him home?" Madison swallowed. "Sweetheart, he's very big, and we don't know if he's not scary," Ella interrupted. "He's just sad." A lump formed in Madison's throat. She glanced back at the dog, who hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. A gust of wind swept through the dock, causing the metal awning above them to creak loudly. Madison tensed instinctively, but Titan only blinked. He was tired. Not just physically, but in a way that went deeper than bones and muscle. He was tired of fighting, tired of running. Madison exhaled sharply. "Ella, we can't just take him. We don't know where he came from. He might belong to someone." Ella frunció el ceño. "He doesn't have a collar." That much was true. No tags, no sign of ownership, but that didn't mean anything. Maybe he had escaped from a bad home. Maybe someone had abandoned him on purpose. And even if they wanted to help, how? She barely made enough to keep food on the table and rent paid. Vet bills, dog food, whatever care he needed. It was too much. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're not the first person to hesitate," said a woman nearby. Madison turned to see Sarah, a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and a thick woolen scarf wrapped around her neck. She had approached quietly, watching the interaction with an expression of understanding. Madison recognized her. Sarah worked at the local animal rescue shelter, just a few blocks from the diner where Madison worked. "I've seen this dog before," Sarah said, stepping closer. "He's been around the docks for months now. People see a pit bull and assume the worst, so they run him off. Others aren't so kind, but he never fights back. He never chases after anyone." Madison hesitated. "He hasn't hurt anyone?" Sarah shook her head. "Not once. I've been leaving food for him when I can, but he never lets anyone close." She looked toward Ella, who was still sitting cross-legged on the pavement. "Until now, apparently." Madison followed her gaze. There was something about the way Titan was watching Ella. Not like a predator sizing up its next meal, not with wariness or suspicion. He just watched, as if he were trying to figure her out, as if no one had ever sat with him like that before. Sarah turned back to Madison, her voice softer. I know what you're thinking. He's big, he's strong, he's a pit bull. But he's not dangerous. He's just been left behind too many times. She nodded toward Ella. And your little girl? She sees what no one else does. She doesn't see a monster. She sees a dog who needs a chance. Madison's chest tightened. She looked at Titan again. The wind ruffled his fur, but he didn't shiver. He didn't move at all except to blink slowly, those tired eyes still locked on Ella. For years, Madison had told herself that their little family was enough, just her and Ella against the world. She had learned not to rely on anyone else, not to let anyone in too easily. People left. People disappointed. That was the reality of things. But this dog, he knew what it was like to be left behind. He knew what it was like to be unwanted. Madison rubbed her hands together, the cold biting at her fingertips. I don't know if I can take care of him, she admitted. I don't have the money for a vet. I don't even know if we're allowed dogs in our building. Sarah smiled gently. I can help with that. The shelter can cover his medical checkup, and I know a few landlords in town who make exceptions for rescues. Madison hesitated. She felt the weight of every practical reason telling her to walk away. But then Ella reached out, her tiny fingers barely brushing Titan's paw. Titan didn't pull away. It was the smallest movement, the tiniest acceptance. But to Madison, it felt like something far bigger than that. Sarah must have sensed the shift because she stepped forward. How about this? You try fostering him for a week, no pressure. See if it works. Madison exhaled, turning the idea over in her mind. A week. That wasn't forever. That was just seeing. She looked down at Ella, who was now gently whispering something to Titan, her voice carrying on the wind. A week. She could do a week. Finally, she nodded. Okay, we'll try it. Ella gasped in delight, clapping her hands together. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Titan lifted his head just slightly, his tail giving a single, slow wag. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first night was the hardest. Madison had expected Titan to be uncertain, even wary, but she hadn't anticipated just how deeply ingrained his distrust would be. After they arrived home, she had led him inside, offering him space, food, and water, but the Pitbull didn't touch any of it. He had hesitated at the threshold, his paws hovering over the welcome mat, as if stepping inside might trigger some invisible trap. It took nearly 10 minutes of coaxing before he finally entered, and even then he remained tense, his body low to the ground, ears flicking at every creak of the house. Ella, of course, had been delighted, skipping around the living room and excitedly pointing out the fluffy dog bed they had set up in the corner. But Titan ignored it. Instead, he settled near the front door, pressing his body into the wall as if preparing for the moment someone would tell him to leave. Madison had seen traumatized dogs before, but something about Titan's stillness unnerved her. He wasn't just being cautious. He was bracing himself, waiting for rejection, as if he had already convinced himself he wouldn't be allowed to stay. By the time night fell, it became clear that Titan had no intention of making himself at home. He refused to eat the meal Madison had prepared for him, even after she left it on the floor and walked away to give him space. He didn't explore the house, didn't respond to his name, and when bedtime came, he refused to move from his spot near the door. Madison sighed as she turned off the hallway light, glancing back at him. "Suit yourself," she murmured. Ella, standing at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, frowned. "Mommy, he looks lonely." Madison exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "I know, sweetheart, but he has to get used to things in his own time." Ella no discutio. But instead of heading to her room, she disappeared down the hallway and returned a moment later, dragging her favorite blanket behind her. Madison watched as her daughter made her way to Titan, moving with the same quiet patience she had shown the first time she met him. She didn't try to pet him, didn't reach out. She simply sat down beside him, wrapping the blanket around herself. "I'll stay with you," Ella whispered, tucking her knees to her chest. "So you don't have to be scared." Titan didn't react at first, but Madison saw the way his ears twitched slightly at the sound of Ella's voice. For nearly 20 minutes, the two of them sat there in silence. And then, to Madison's quiet astonishment, Titan shifted. It was subtle, just a small adjustment, a barely there movement. But instead of pressing himself harder against the door, he let his body relax just slightly, his muscles unclenching enough that he no longer looked ready to bolt at any second. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. By the second night, Titan still refused to sleep inside a room. Madison left the door to the laundry room open, thinking he might prefer a smaller enclosed space to rest. But again, he chose the front door, curling into the corner as if expecting to be removed at any moment. Ella no lo questionó. She simply repeated what she had done the night before, bringing her blanket downstairs, sitting beside him, whispering little stories about her day. "You're safe now, Titan," she murmured at one point. "You don't have to be alone anymore." Titan didn't respond, but he also didn't move away. By the fourth night, Madison found herself pausing at the top of the stairs, watching the two of them. Ella had drifted off to sleep, curled up under her blanket, her small fingers lightly touching the edge of Titan's paw. The dog was still awake, staring at the door, but his posture had changed. His ears were no longer pinned back, his body no longer tense. He wasn't fully relaxed, but there was something different about him, something almost contemplative, as if he was trying to understand this new world he had found himself in. Then, as if sensing Madison's gaze, he looked up at her. She wasn't sure what she expected to see. More wariness, perhaps. The same distant, lifeless stare he had worn at the docks. But instead, for the first time, there was something else in his eyes. Something softer. Something almost like curiosity. By the fifth night, everything changed. The house was quiet, the dim glow of the street lamp outside casting soft light into the living room. As usual, Ella had brought her blanket downstairs, sitting next to Titan in her usual spot. She was humming softly, a quiet, absent-minded tune that carried through the stillness of the house. Titan, as always, remained still, watching, listening. And then, as if finally making a decision he had been weighing for days, he moved. It was slow, so slow that at first Madison thought she had imagined it. But then she saw it clearly. Titan shifting forward just an inch, his massive head lowering toward Ella's small frame. Then, in a gesture so small yet so profound, he rested his head against her leg. Madison felt something in her chest tighten. Ella no se movió por un momento, como si estuviera dando a Titan la oportunidad de cambiar de opinión. And when he didn't, when he simply remained there, his breathing slow and steady, she lifted her hand and gently stroked the top of his head. "Good boy, Titan," she whispered. Titan exhaled, a deep, quiet sigh. For the first time, he wasn't just existing. He was beginning to believe. The afternoon was warm, sunlight streaming through the backyard as Ella played, her laughter ringing through the air like a melody. She was chasing a butterfly, arms outstretched, her tiny feet kicking up little clouds of dust as she ran across the grass. Titan lay nearby, his massive body stretched out in the shade of the porch, ears flicking lazily at the occasional buzz of a passing insect. He had been with them for nearly 2 weeks now, and while he was still adjusting, there was no denying the changes in him. His coat had regained some of its luster with regular meals and gentle baths. The once constant tension in his muscles had eased, and though he still had moments of wariness, he no longer flinched at every unexpected noise. He was learning what it meant to be safe. But safety, as Titan had learned in his past life, was fragile, and that afternoon, it was tested. Inside the house, Madison was at the stove, humming softly as she stirred a pot of soup. She had grown used to the sounds of Ella's laughter outside, to the steady rhythm of her child's voice filtering in through the open window. But as she reached for the salt, something changed. Silence. It was abrupt, unnatural. The kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Madison wiped her hands on a dish towel, stepping toward the window. That was when she saw him. A man stood at the far edge of the yard. He wasn't supposed to be there. Dressed in faded jeans and a worn-out hoodie, he moved with a casualness that sent a bolt of unease straight through Madison's chest. His hands were shoved in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but his eyes, dark and calculating, were scanning the yard, scanning the house, scanning Ella. Madison's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth to call out, but before a single sound could escape her lips, Titan moved. One moment, he was lying beneath the porch. The next, he was on his feet, every muscle in his body taut, his ears standing erect, his dark eyes locked onto the intruder. A low, warning growl rumbled deep in his chest, vibrating through the air like a distant roll of thunder. Ella, sensing the shift in energy, froze. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to the Pitbull that now stood between him and the little girl. He took half a step forward. Titan snarled. It wasn't just a growl this time. It was a sound pulled from something primal, something ancient, an unspoken command that even the most ignorant of men would understand. A warning, a promise. The man stopped. His confidence faltered, the easy smirk on his lips replaced by something uncertain, something almost fearful. His gaze darted from Titan's bared teeth to the sheer size of the dog now standing guard over the child. Titan didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break eye contact. The Pitbull's body was a wall, an unshakable force between Ella and whatever danger lurked in the man's intentions. For several long seconds, no one moved. And then, just like that, the man took a step back, then another. His hands came up in a mock gesture of surrender, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Relax, big guy," he muttered. But Titan did not relax. His growl only deepened, his stance unwavering. The man took the hint. He turned sharply on his heel, disappearing back through the side gate, his pace just a little too fast to be casual. Only when the gate clicked shut did Titan finally lower his head, his growl fading into silence. That was the moment Madison reached the door. She burst onto the porch, her heart hammering in her chest as she scanned the yard, her eyes wild with panic. "Ella?" The little girl turned, her blue eyes wide but calm. "I'm okay, Mommy." Madison dropped to her knees, pulling her daughter into her arms, pressing frantic kisses against her hair. Her heart was still pounding, adrenaline still rushing through her veins. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze to Titan. He was standing just a few feet away, his body still tense, his ears still perked as he watched the now empty gate. But when Madison called his name, his head turned toward her. She exhaled shakily, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Titan had protected her child. Without hesitation, without command, without expectation, he had stepped forward when it mattered most. Her breath caught in her throat. She had spent days, weeks, worrying about whether Titan was too much, too big, too unpredictable, too dangerous. But now, as she looked at him, standing there, powerful and unyielding, a silent guardian, she saw him for what he truly was. Not a stray, not a burden, a protector, a part of their family. Madison slowly extended a hand. For the first time, she didn't reach cautiously, didn't hesitate. She simply placed her palm against the side of Titan's face, feeling the warmth of his fur, the steady rise and fall of his breath beneath her fingers. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Titan didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, gently, he leaned into her touch. Ella giggled softly, reaching up to pat Titan's head. "Told you he wasn't scary," she said with a knowing grin. Madison let out a shaky laugh, her hand still resting on Titan's fur. He wasn't scary. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. A salty breeze drifted through the quiet neighborhood, rustling the trees, whispering against the windows, slipping through the cracks beneath the door. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But outside, Titan lay awake. The old Pitbull curled himself into a tight ball just beyond the front porch, his body a solid, unmoving shadow beneath the dim porch light. The cold didn't seem to bother him, nor did the hard wooden planks beneath his body. He was used to this. This was where he belonged, on the outside looking in. Inside, Ella slept soundly, one tiny hand resting on her stuffed rabbit, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Madison had tucked her in nearly an hour ago, pressing a kiss to her forehead, smoothing a stray curl behind her ear. But despite the long day, despite the exhaustion still clinging to her limbs, Madison couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the afternoon. The way Titan had moved, so sure, so instinctive, when that stranger appeared. The way he had shielded Ella without hesitation, a silent protector standing between her child and danger. The way he had held his ground, unwavering, fearless. Titan had saved Ella. And now, there he was, alone again, just beyond the threshold of their home, waiting for a command that never came. Madison swallowed hard, her throat tightening with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She had spent so much time doubting him, fearing what he might be capable of, wondering if she had made a mistake. But what she had seen today hadn't been something to fear. It had been something to trust. The thought unsettled her in a way she didn't expect. It cracked something inside her, something she had held on to for too long. She sat up, her heart pounding in a slow, steady rhythm. And before she could talk herself out of it, she got out of bed. Moving quietly, she made her way through the house, down the dimly lit hallway, past Ella's room, past the kitchen, past the warmth of everything she had built to keep them safe. She unlocked the front door, hesitating only for a second before pushing it open. The cool air met her instantly, sending a slight chill through her thin sweater. But she barely felt it. Titan lifted his head at the sound of the door creaking open. His ears perked, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers, alert but hesitant. He didn't move, not toward her, not away. He just watched. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Madison stepped outside. She lowered herself onto the porch steps, her knees tucking close to her chest as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't look at Titan right away. Instead, she stared ahead, her gaze unfocused, listening to the distant rhythm of the tide rolling in and out. Titan remained still. Madison knew she could go back inside, knew she could pretend she hadn't felt this shift in her chest, that she wasn't sitting here beside a dog she had once considered a risk, a mistake, a burden too heavy to carry. But the truth was, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Titan wasn't just some stray dog they had picked up from the docks. He wasn't just a pit bull with a troubled past. He was family. She turned her head slightly, her eyes finally meeting his. His body was still tense, unsure of what this moment meant. He was waiting for her to decide. Her throat tightened. "You don't have to stay out here, you know," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the wind. Titan didn't react, but she knew he had heard her. Madison sighed, rubbing her hands together before reaching out, slowly, carefully. Titan flinched, just slightly, just enough for her to see the ghost of old wounds still lingering beneath his skin. She didn't pull back. She simply let her hand rest on his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath her fingers. His fur was coarse but warm, solid beneath her palm. A lump formed in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. Titan didn't move for a long time. Then, as if something inside him finally gave way, he exhaled. A deep, steady sigh, his body loosening beneath her touch. It was acceptance, not just from her, but from him. Madison swallowed past the tightness in her chest, blinking rapidly against the unexpected burn in her eyes. Titan hadn't just been rescued, he was rescuing them too. She let her hand linger on his back for a moment longer before pulling it away. She stood up, stretching out the stiffness in her legs. Titan lifted his head slightly, watching her. Madison took a step toward the open door, then paused. A choice had to be made. She turned back, her voice soft but certain. "Come inside, Titan." For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then, slowly, cautiously, Titan stood. It wasn't hesitant, wasn't reluctant. It was something else entirely. It was trust. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold, and this time, he didn't look back. The morning sun spilled through the living room windows, casting soft golden light across the hardwood floors. Outside, birds chirped in the trees, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the quiet hum of a home just beginning to stir. Then, the sound of tiny feet thudding against the stairs broke the stillness. Ella came bounding down, her blonde curls bouncing with every step, her excitement spilling over in bright, breathless laughter. In her hands, she clutched a small wrapped box, the edges slightly crumpled from being held too tightly. She skidded to a stop in the middle of the living room, her eyes immediately landing on the large, brindle-coated dog sprawled across the couch. Titan lifted his head at the commotion, blinking sleepily. "Titan!" Ella beamed, climbing onto the couch beside him. She threw her arms around his thick neck, her tiny fingers disappearing into the warmth of his fur. "Happy gotcha day." Titan let out a soft huff, his tail thumping lazily against the cushion. A year ago, he wouldn't have understood this, a celebration just for him. A name spoken with so much love. Arms wrapped around him, not in fear, not to push him away, but to hold him close. A year ago, he had been alone, curled up in the cold outside a warehouse, waiting for a future that never seemed to come. Now, he was home. Madison leaned against the kitchen doorway, a mug of coffee cradled between her hands, watching the scene unfold with a soft smile. She had never imagined, in those first days of uncertainty, that they would come to this. That Titan would become something more than a stray they had taken in out of sympathy. He was family. Ella se retiró, sosteniendo el pequeño regalo que había traído. "This is for you," she announced proudly, placing it on the couch in front of him. "Open it." Titan sniffed at the package, nudging it carefully before looking back at her. Ella giggled. "Okay, I'll help." She tore at the paper with clumsy excitement, revealing a brand new collar, a deep blue band with silver engraving. She lifted it, turning it so Titan and Madison could both see. "Titan, our guardian." Madison felt her throat tighten. Ella reached forward, her fingers gentle as she fastened the new collar around Titan's neck. "Now everyone will know you belong here," she whispered. "Because you do." Titan, once a dog with nowhere to go, leaned into Ella's touch, his tail wagging in slow, steady contentment. He wasn't just rescued, he was chosen. Because family isn't just where we come from, it's where we are loved. Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by commitment and love. Dave Willis. Titan was once a dog that the world had forgotten, left to wander the streets, searching for scraps and warmth. But in the end, he found something more than just a home. He found a family that saw his worth, a child who gave him love, and a purpose greater than survival. This story is a testament to the power of kindness, to the belief that even the most broken souls can find healing when given a chance. Perhaps it reminds us that the love we give, even to those who cannot speak our language, always finds its way back to us. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Have you ever had a pet that changed your life? Or perhaps you've been the one to rescue an animal in need? I'd love to hear your story. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Vale Marks. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life, and reaching 1,000 subscribers would mean the world. It's the encouragement I need to keep creating heartfelt, meaningful videos for you. As the great Mahatma Gandhi once said, "The greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated." Let's be the change. Let's be the kindness the world needs. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.